What's going on, Chasin Tails, folks? It's episode 78. Tonight be one of the most nervous I feel like I've ever been as a host. I mean, we got the most dominant person in unlimited hydroplanes, a career that spans many decades. He got his first unlimited final win when I was born. So if that tells you anything, I'm 33 now, and the fact that I got to race with him this year is pretty dang cool too. So it's awesome that he's been able to hang around sport this long. He's obviously the all-time leader in race wins, 11 Gold Cups, just got his last one this year. I say last one because he's retired, but I ain't saying he's retired forever. Never know, he might come back. And he's also getting inducted in the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America coming up, I believe, in a month. So down at Daytona Beach. So that's pretty cool. So I think without further ado, we'll bring Dave Villwock on. How's it going, Dave?
Hi, fellas. How are you doing?
Good.
Doing good.
First off, honored to have you on here, and thank you for coming on your birthday. That's pretty cool. So happy birthday to you.
I'm nearly famous and a legend in my own mind.
I think a few more minds than just one. So
we always start off with the same question for most all our racers is, how'd you get your start in the sport? Not just unlimited, like where did you get your start? Was it outboards? Was it inboards? How'd you get going?
Like most people with family, my uncle he had raced 135 hydroplanes and then 225 hydroplanes. And when I was like 8 or 10 years old, I was following him around, going to a couple of races to watch that. It was way more interesting than the farm I grew up on. Taking care of cows and horses and fences was way less fun than working on an engine or something. So that's where I got my start and started following him around. And then when my cousin and I, he was just a year ahead of me, he got old enough that we both got old enough where you could ride in a cracker box. And my uncle saw that. He was doing it he built his own boats. He built his own Jones boat. And he built his own motors like everybody did back then. Nobody did anything themselves. Nobody bought everything done. They did most everything themselves. And so he wasn't like everybody. He wasn't super serious. But then when we got old enough, he decided that he'd go get a cracker box because you could sign up. You could sign off to get a 15-year-old kid to ride in those. So that's what we did when we were old enough to do that. And that got started. And then actually we were building another cracker box to be a little more competitive. And about that same time, my brother was racing for Yamaha. And he'd hurt his knee. And one of those things back then, they didn't have knee replacements. Back then, the doctor said, okay, you get a choice next time. You get straight or bent, you decide. So he went, maybe it'd be a good time to step off of motorcycles and motocross. And he asked me one day, and as a sheet metal worker, we were working in a place called Brown Plumbing and Heating that we'd started up along with family again. My brother came in and says, hey, I don't think I'm going to race bikes anymore. He says, can we buy a good race boat? Maybe we'll go do that together for a while. Well, yeah. I mean, we were building a cracker box, but there was a good one, which was the Lemon Crate. It was one of those $1 zillion builds. Everything was anodized, chromed. I mean, it was the high dollar boat that we all just drooled over. Never really thought you'd get to touch one. And he goes, oh, really? Yeah. I said, yeah, but we can't afford it. I said, that thing's $1 zillion boat. We're not getting nowhere near it. He goes, well, how do you know? You haven't asked. And I said, well, I guess you're right. I says, well, let's look first. We had like $4,000 between the two of us we could rub together. And so he said, call him. All he knew is say no. It was a good life lesson. Called him up and said, hey, I told him what we were doing and why. And I said, I said, we probably can't afford it. But I said, well, what are you asking for it? And he goes, well, how much you got? I says, well, just between the brother and we got $4,000. And he leaned over his shoulder and he said, Toy, that was his wife. He says, you want to sell the cracker box? She goes, are they going to race it? I said, yeah, we're going to go race it. And so he says, okay, come on down, pick it up.
Yeah. That's
complete
awesome.
Boat, motor, trailer, 2 sets of seats because he didn't like the seats getting wet, and a couple sets of headers and enough gaskets that last us for about 5 years. So we were good.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool. You started riding. What would you say was the first thing what surprised you the most when you started driving? What was the feeling difference from going from that rider's seat to the driver's seat?
Not a lot. I mean, they were about the same. You're a little more control, of course. Of course, that just adds responsibility and start sequences and speeds and all that stuff that had to be learned. But, it was a good family thing. We took 2 boats and went to a bunch of races. My uncle, in the middle of this, my uncle called me up and says, hey, your cousin's going to go in the Air Force. could I invest in it so we can just all do it together? I said, I don't care. That's fine. Let's go. So we took 2 boats and went everywhere and turned it into a family thing there for a couple of years.
That's awesome.
So when we went
that's
there, we were going to, I think the points, what did I had? One year I won 8,000 points.
wow.
Jeez.
That's going everywhere.
We were running like 25, 30 races a year, and there wasn't a structure to diminish that. And Region 10 had a zillion races. I mean, we were racing every weekend someplace, but it taught us how to race in like a series where you got to be there every week.
Yeah.
Yep. Commitments.
You learn how to take care
That's
of
really
yourself.
cool.
So
So did you start making changes to that cracker box to make it faster? Or did you start making changes to boats later on in the years?
Later on in the years, really, he was a connection with a mentor. And probably the biggest thing that made me successful probably was finding mentors. I sat in the motorhome with Roger Penske one day in Portland, Oregon. He had asked me to come down, hang out with him in an IndyCar race. And so I was down there and I'm sitting there talking to him. And we're talking about personnel and running teams and the stuff that we were doing at the time. And he says, you kind of boiled it all down, and it's a common statement. He goes, isn't it interesting that people work hard, often get lucky? And,
Yep.
and as you go through life, I think if you show enough initiative and enough ambition and a little bit of intelligence, people that are standing around, the older people that were standing around go, well, you need this, or here, you should think about that. They mentor you along the way. And, and I did just, people that ran the Atlas program, he liked me, and another guy that worked with him that raced a stock 7-liter, like the motor I put in the super stock was something that we spent a couple of winters developing camshafts for a stock 7-liter. But they had brought me with them to show me how a dyno worked and how you read it and what you're looking for in torque curves. And, back then you didn't have a Superflow where it just collected all the data. You had like 4 or 5 guys that you had to watch. Everybody, you'd get it up to an RPM, and then you had to take readings, and then put all the information together. It wasn't digital yet. So, but it was a good dyno. The guy that did this parking all, the guy that did a bunch of IndyCar stuff. And so he was another really bright guy that had all the right stuff. So you could learn a lot from it. But that was probably what helped me the most, was doing that. And then probably in the last, there's a whole story going up to, I really tried not to be in unlimited racing. When I was about 10 years old, I went over to George Henley's house. He was a friend of my uncle, and we'd went to a race and stopped by his house, and I'd go sit in the Miss Tide Air, which we thought was the fastest boat there in the world at the time. And, so I remember that. And one day I saw him at an unlimited race in Seattle, and I went up to him and says, hey, this is really cool to see you involved in this. He goes, be careful what you wish for. He said, this thing's about broken.
Yeah.
And so, I went, he's right about that. I had at that point in time, that was about 1987, 88. I'd helped Ron Jones with a bunch of stuff. There's a couple of things that happened with some companies that moved around. And so I took some time. I thought we were going to build a hydroplane. So I thought it'd be a good idea to learn all about that. And they'd asked me down there to help some things like the first composite sponsons. They couldn't figure out how to make the things retain their shape, and then Ron Jones Sr. came over to me and says, how would you do that? And I said, well, we got a machine down at National Blower and Sheet Metal. I can roll a 40-foot angle. So how long do you want it? So I just told him to buy some 6-inch angle, and we rolled the angle to fit the backbone of the flat side or the air trap side of the sponson was, stable. Because when they were heating the thing up, they were all doing pre-preg back then. We thought that was the way to go. And so you heat that thing up to 250 or better, and shit starts happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the first boat you ever built? Because I know my dad, he already commented that he drove the F400 once, and it was one of the best boats he drove back then. Yeah. Was that your first one you built, or was there ones prior to that?
Yeah. No, I'd helped on, because I was a fabricator sheet metal guy. When there was some project in the boat racing world, they'd said, hey, can you help us with this? Can you help us with that? And they were trying to figure out, I'd be another mentor, Ron Jones and Ron Jones Jr. That, I'd been around those guys at times to learn things before the hydroplanes, just because I knew they were smart guys, and they'd showed me a lot of things, but they knew what I could do because they'd have some problem and I'd whip out a solution, and And so when they started building capsules, like for the 7-Eleven, they go, hey, can you come help us with this? And when they built some ATA boats, they go, hey, can you help them with this? And then when we built that first boat that your dad drove, that was the first one that we took a serious look at. But I've been talking to Ron for years about shapes and what the shapes of the boats weren't quite right. And that boat wasn't right either. But we went part way in that we moved the rudder way back, and then we did that because we'd moved the skid fin back. So, if you move just the fin, then the thing turns into a Jeep, and all of a sudden it's not going to steer very good. So we made sure that I fabricated some stuff to go back. And with that boat, Ron was thinking that the double, triple pickle, the thing that had a vented transom to it. And he thought as the boat rose up, the air would vent out the back and it would come back down. It's not really what happened. What it amounted to was, like anybody who's dropped a piece of 4x8 piece of plywood on the floor knows that when it gets down to the last inch, it slows right down, right? Air compresses.
Yep.
Well, same thing happens with the boat. That rear of the boat, that big section that's there. In fact, like Ron and I, one night, we went through all the drawings of all the boats that had been successful over like 20 years. And we looked at them. They all had a 6 or 7 foot break in them.
Oh, wow.
And that aligned up with it. Went, look at that. All the other things we've tried that worked, but other boats had blown over more. And some other things where that particular model hadn't. We spent like 3 hours going over, just pulling out all his drawings of all kinds of different boats, from 280s, 145s, 7 liters, Grand Prix, all of that stuff. And the one common denominator was it had a longer, the brake was further forward. So it had more bottom in the back of the boat.
Yeah.
So when we vented the back of the boat, like he did in T1, the Budweiser, they vented that. And then we kind of followed the same thing. Ron just wanted to chase that some.
Mm.
And the other thing with that boat is and Ron didn't like that a lot. He didn't like when I put a canard up in the front of it. And then I hooked it to a foot pedal, which none of those guys thought that a foot pedal was a great idea at all. I just knew that would work.
Yep.
And I built a bunch of stuff for Ron, where we first had the first full flying canards up forward, and we had them. Ron wanted to use electronic actuators, and I went out and drove them. But I says, man, and Budweiser did the same thing. They had electric actuators driving the flaps and stuff, but you're just way behind the curve all the time. And having driven flat bottoms, I went, that's just not even possible. It may be possible in a tunnel boat, and I don't have any experience in those, but that may be possible with that. But with an inboard hydroplane, it needed to be way more proactive than that. By the time you waited for, it was upside down and backwards before you got the canard all the way up.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that turned out, we put that on that boat, built a couple of good motors, and it was fast. As fast as they are today back then.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's wild how they evolved so much, and then you guys, I feel like the money went away, and then we've just been running the same stuff you guys developed with Budweiser for till now. Some new things, I'm sure, but nothing's been like the next level. So on that thought, what do you think is the next level? What portion of the boat, you don't have to get into details, but what do you think the next portion of the boat to make a drastic change would be?
Well, first off, it won't matter what you do. If I dreamt up something that isn't, I don't think, possible, because I could take you through all of the different design things that we did. I did one right thing. I did 2 right things when I went to circus. I went to circus, and actually Chip was Hannah, was going to charge him a bunch of money, and Chip, in the story getting there was an whole other story. It was unlikely. I actually told him no, but Chip was working him over for money. And so Bennett called me up one night and he says, why don't you just drive the boat? You've won all these championships. You set all the records. And I said, Mr. Bennett, you hired me to win championships in this boat. And we got some pretty formidable guys, Budweiser, Winston, Tide, all the guys that had pretty well-funded programs at the time. I said, I think I have some ideas that will make us run out front, but I don't know anything about the race courses, and you hired me to win in the next couple of years. You need to hire that guy right there. He knows way more about this than I do. And he goes, okay. And so he did. But what I got out of that is I got to sit back there and watch what he said was a good idea and a bad idea, and different race courses, where's a good place and a bad place. And, and how to do a lot of things. Like I remember one time, John Love is a guy out of Detroit there that worked with Chip and Penske and a bunch of people for a long time. He worked for Miller and Penske and Pennzoil and a bunch of stuff with those guys. And he came into me one day. This was when I was driving Budweiser. He came in and he sat down in the truck in Detroit and he says, "So what are you going to do?" This was leading up, I think, the last heat or final. And so I go into this long rendition of this guy's going to do that and that guy's going to do that. And this boat for this guy isn't going to go here and there, and all the things that Chip and I would go through of how to figure out what to do. And you'd learned over that process that this is a way more cerebral game than what we did in limited boats. This is this is the big marbles. So you had to think through all of those things if you were going to be successful. You had to learn how not to throw away a race. There's a million ways to throw it away. So you try to not do that. Like a good example, Chip, one time we were in Detroit and we were running about the same as fast as the Budweiser guys. And I said, "So what are you going to do? You're going to try to get the inside?" And he says, "It's a good idea if I could for sure get back here first at the rooster tail turn, then that'd be a good idea. If not, it's not." And so you learn, okay, well, and a lot of guys in this sport will say, "Oh, I had to get the inside. Inside is everything." And I went, "Well, it depends." And that's what you learn over time is you learn how to slow people down. Instead of throwing the race away to try to get an inside lane and then get trapped, you find a different way to win. You guys have done that with, I think, the HR. You've had to learn to run in a different place where a lot of guys don't want to run any place but the inside. In fact, their spirit goes. You watch them, they just don't. The guy who loses the inside to someone, he's done. He's mentally, he's kind of checking out. They're not approaching the race with the same passion that they do. And so a lot of this is all cerebral. And so I'm going through all this stuff with John Love in the truck, and he laughs at me and he goes, "You want to know what the last guy we're working with said?" And I came in here and he says, "We've had all these long conversations about what's going to happen during this whole race, not just the final, but, throughout the whole day." And he said, "I went into the last guy here," and he says, "Well, what are you going to do?" And expecting this long answer. And the guy says, "I'm going to go out and mash the gas." And you're going, "Oh, Christ."
Yep, that's it.
And so you learn, you learn
That's
over
awesome.
that deal of, sometimes you're doing the rope-a-dope. Like here's a great example of Pico. I'm in Detroit. Chip's driving the Budweiser. I'm driving the Pico boat. Tate's driving the Smoking Joes, and they got our old circus boat, so they're pretty good. And Fred's were getting that thing going that year. And so I go out in one heat and I run 2 laps with Hanauer out of a 4-lap race, like 2.5 laps or so. And then I just sort of let him go. I went, yep, I could try to run him down, but this was the first heat of a Gold Cup of a 5-heat event. And so I just let him go. And then the owner of Pico, Larry Wisney, came over and he goes, "Man, it looked like you just let him go." And I says, "I did." And he says, "Well, why'd you do that?" I says, "Larry, this is a long race. There's a million ways to screw it up. There's only, you have to be in it to win it." And he looks at me like, I don't know about this driver guy. He's maybe not as serious as we need. And 15 minutes later, Tate and Hanauer go into the first turn. Tate crowds Hanauer a little bit. Hanauer runs over the top of the Smoking Does. They're both out of the race.
Wow.
Larry Wisney comes back like 10 minutes later. He goes, points to my feet, goes, "I see what you mean." Kind of important. I says, "Yep."
I mean, you see a Valley Field every year. There's people that still don't understand that lesson.
Yeah, they just
It's a
put
long weekend there.
Everything on kill. You got to make it to that final.
Here's another great story. A guy that was a mentor that designed the flat bottoms I built and taught me a lot. He's a genius level guy. He did all the design for all those giant super yachts and the Purseiner boats that they built at Delta Marine. And his hobby was these flat bottom boats, which are pretty good. But he taught me a lot about how they did, as well as like the Cracker Box guy, Bob Patterson. They were unbelievably talented guy that knew more about boats in general than you would ever believe. But I'm racing into divisionals. I got a Hemi I resurrected this old Hemi, and I got this in one of the boats, and I'm driving it as hard as I can, and I'm getting up next to these guys from California, got a way bigger, better motor than we do and all that. But I'm running my ass off, and I finally just about crashed the boat 2 or 3 times, but win the race, the first heat. And I come back in, and I go, "Whoo, that was tough. Those guys are fast." And the guy, his name was Steve Jones, he looked at me, and he says, He said, you went about that all wrong. You can do that way easier. And I went, what do you mean I can do that way? He says, do you have enough respect for me to do exactly what I tell you to do? I says, yep. What do you want? And he says, what I want you to do is I want you to go out and make a start with that guy. Just get alongside him and then make a start. Don't care whether you break the clock or whatever. Just get alongside that guy and make a start with him. And as soon as you get even with him, do not pass him. Make sure to stay alongside of him the whole time. And then in the last half a lap, then you can go ahead and go as fast as you want. But you're going to find out this is going to be way easier than you ever thought possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what I'll do. So I get alongside the guy and we run for about 2 laps out of the 4 laps. It was on the Snake River. It was kind of rough and stuff. Next thing I know, I'm driving the boat at like 98%. And he's driving his boat at 10/10. And next thing you know, he makes a mistake. He trips the boat and he's back like 10 boat lengths. And I go, that was way easier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't near as heroic, but it looked the same in the end. It looked like you pulled ahead. All you really did was run the boat within control and let them screw the race up, which often happens. And I think, and I'm telling you guys all this stuff because I think that's one of the, learning stuff like that from people, in all kinds of different things that I've just said to you. You learn things of how not to lose the race. And sometimes you can make it way easier. And I don't know how many times I've done that same thing. After that, in Unlimiteds and everything else, I go, I'm just going to get alongside him. Something will happen.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
You just wait, and it's pretty soon. 9 chances out of 10, they just go away. Somebody overdrives the boat or misses the corner or does something. But if you drive the boat within control, you have to press at some point in time. But you try to limit the amount of liability, limit the amount that you're driving a boat at 11/10 out of 10, and you'll win a lot more races.
Yeah, it's just like knowing your competition. Like, say if you're fighting for lanes and this guy can't turn the boat on the buoy row, but you force him to have the inside of you and you just hold him tight because he can't, he'll have to let out or he'll spit out. And it's just knowing what.
And some guys are psychology.
Yeah.
Some guys just don't like to be there. There are some guys that are inside guys, and some guys just don't want to be anywhere near that. So if you can figure out how to place that guy in that, everybody has all kinds of little different triggers. Like I remember, like Hanauer was set up. He was driving the Pico boat, and we knew they're gonna, have a big motor in the final. They've been doing that. Later on, we found out they had propane tanks on the side of the boat, so they could run one heat with propane. That's why they got that with a gold cup. And I should give them credit. That later on, Jeff Miner was working for Elstrom, and I says, why did you just save one monster motor? He goes, oh no. He says, crap. Sometimes when Fred would want to run 2 heats, I'd have to cut the tank out overnight and put a new deck on and then paint it and get it ready to go.
My gosh. Wow.
That's awesome.
So,
that's crazy.
You learn all kinds of stuff about what, people can and will do. But anyway,
I think that leads into one of the questions we had on our list is, what do you feel like? Well, first off, we'll start. Our stat guy got us some things. And do you know how many racers you've raced against in Unlimited?
I have no idea.
So Nick Kish, I don't know how he gets all this info, but
we have like 3 or 4 pages of stats.
There's a bunch of pages here. 57 drivers. That's how many you faced between 92 and 2025.
Just one class. That's a lot.
Who do you feel like was the fiercest competitor you had, or the one that you really? Well, we'll go with fiercest first, and then maybe one you felt most comfortable with. So.
Well, Hanauer was about as good as they come. And his numbers show that. He was a guy that. Well, I'll go back. During the circus years, we could tell that this is a way more physical endeavor than any other boat is, right? And back then, believe me, they're pussycats now. When they had 4,000 horsepower in them, they were a different animal. They just had a lot more torque and a lot more acceleration. And, you had to do things with the boat to keep them on the water. And that didn't make them drive any better either. I used to call them an old school bus. They didn't drive so good. They still don't, but they're way easier now than they used to be. So, he was a great competitor. Steve David had a good run there. That he was very competitive. Garrett was a great driver and a hard driver. But he seemed like he made a lot of mistakes. And you see a lot of that guys that are throwing it away to get the inside, and it doesn't always the best place, you know. When I was first, I mean, I did the clock start and stuff, and people get an idea, and I'm sure you have. It's in limited boats, and especially in flat bottoms, you can change around and change up the time. Pretty easy to get your timing mark where you want it, you know. But these things are giant buses. They don't adjust much. And I remember the first time you used to have to, when you qualified as a driver, you had to hit the start. I think it was within 5 seconds or something of zero. You know, they wanted to make sure that you were pretty competent in getting to the start line. And so they would do that. They made that requirement. So you went out to qualify, they did a simulated start. So and before I went out, Chip came up and says, do you want some timing marks or stuff? And I said, no, I can get it. No problem. And he goes, you're going to want to know, you know, and I went, you know, because I hadn't really tried to place it in anything. All I'd done is run it around the course, you know, so I knew a little about driving it, but not much, you know. But then when the start came up, I went, shit, you know, I barely made it, you know. It was, wow, this is a whole different thing, you know. It doesn't adjust well, you know. And so that's a whole other thing. That's why I think a lot of things, the boats beat you up, and you know, so a lot of guys don't continue to do it. It's not as much fun as like your 5-liter, you know, it's beating the crap out of you the most of the time.
Yeah.
And that's, and that takes a different personality like that, you know, and to operate in that environment, we're getting the shit kicked out of you all the time.
Did you ever drive a Grand Prix?
Yeah. Actually, that's what got me involved in it. I was building a lot of motors for people, and just select people. And a guy had a big 7-liter that was supposed to be a Grand Prix that Kelson had built. And I was watching him because they were blowing up a motor every day, and he was trying to run a stock 7-liter motor, but it wasn't going well for him. And finally, I felt sorry for him one day, and I went over and I says, do you need some help with that? And so he goes, yeah, you know, he spent a lot of money on it, but he just wasn't getting there from here. So I says, well, I'll just kind of get some parts together and go see if we can make it run. And we did that, and turned out where he was having some fun at it. And then he wanted to build something better. You know, of course, no, I'm just not going to build a regular blower thing. I had to go find a turbocharger that a K-boat buddy had. And I drove that thing both with the stock motor in it. It was a 24-foot boat. And then with the turbocharged motor in it, that was the first time I went, you know, I kind of like these things. I think I'd be good in big hydroplanes because it just had a whole different feel. You had a lot more boat around you than a pro stock, but you had 1,000 horsepower in a 16-foot boat. You know, it was a whole different feel. It looked like more fun.
Yeah, they are fun. I tell you what, though, after jumping out of doing all those laps in Madison to get qualified and then going out in the GP for testing, I thought the GP, something was wrong with it. It was vibrating like crazy. I'm like, Mom, on my radio, something's wrong with this boat. She's like, just figure it out. You'll be fine. But the difference between how smooth the Unlimited is, I mean, the roller, sure, but like no vibrations. And then jumping in that, it's like my brain was rattling.
Yeah. They're all different. You know, physically they don't take as much, but they react differently.
That's a fact.
So you said you did early on, a lot of your involvement in boat racing wasn't necessarily as a racer. It was more on shore, right? Between engines and just kind of almost like consulting in a way.
No, we were driving. I mean,
You were?
I
Okay.
was driving everything pretty much.
I guess I asked, like, because you, I think more than a lot, you're obviously very analytical, and your knowledge about the boats in general is say second to very few, if any. Do you feel, I guess, how much was that elevated by getting to drive? Because there's a lot of very bright minds in the sport that don't drive or haven't driven for a long time. As somebody who basically since you started till now has been massively involved in improvements and different changes to various boats, like how much of your driving experience do you attribute to that versus just your general knowledge?
Driving talent attribute to what?
Like to your the info and the advice and the knowledge you're able to put into boats. Like how much of that do you think comes from the time you spent as a driver as compared to just the general knowledge you have between aero and props and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think somebody said, when I was helping them with boats, they go, man, and that's how I got involved with it, frankly. I was supposed to run the Luxor Hotel. That's what I was supposed to do. We had finished with the circus deal. We had a 3-year program, and Bennett said, you want to quit it too? So we're going to sell everything, but you're going to come work for me. So I was down there in Vegas I was doing a lot of different things. I ended up running Arneson Marine for a while until we got it sold. And then my schedule was to go to the Luxor Hotel, which was just coming up out of the ground for Circus Enterprises. I had to go down and run the Colorado Bell for a couple of, a few months so you can get your big league license on the strip, when that hotel started. But Bennett liked it that he wanted me to come work for him. He knew I approached the way he did. And so he knew that my dad was a plumber. My grandfather was an electrician and my uncle was a sheet metal worker. So if there was some problem in the hotel, he kind of put me in his position with, if engineering didn't have an answer, call Dave, So that's what I was going to do. But one day, because we had developed, just like the double, triple pickle, we thought that a multi-wing design might be the thing that would help stabilize the boats. Turned out we were wrong for a lot of reasons, but one was yaw, the boats yaw, and so they lost a lot of their lift and skidding around the corner. And so that's one of the reasons a boat would wet up, and hobby horse and stuff like that. And so, you weren't gaining anything there. They'd tear themselves apart if you got on rough water. There was a lot of I won a race with it, but, when it got to the river courses, it wasn't very good. And
Gotcha.
And we learned that. And I really learned the big lesson when Glenn Davis, one of my mentors that took me to the dyno and did all kinds of things for me. He was building that Elam canard boat. And, we'd looked at that. And like I said, I still had a different opinion of trying to figure out. I'd done quite a little bit of wind tunnel work already. So I knew a lot of the whys about what that needed to look like. And one of the advantage I had in model airplanes, a lot of my friends worked at NASA on the space shuttle program. So they were building space shuttle models and then dropping from other models and trying to fly them to the ground to see how that was going to work. How are you going to fly something that didn't have a wing? It was nothing but a lifty body shape. And I thought that was a great advantage in terms of looking at the shape differently, where Ron looked at it as all in wing sections and lift. And a lot of people did. Mech is everybody. The only thing that I brought two things to the sport. One was, the propeller star is longer. But when I went to Circus, I told him, well, first I said no, because I just didn't. I had done some things for him, and I told him that boat was going to crash. And then, sure enough, the Circus and then the Madison boat blew over at San Diego there.
Yep.
So, you can imagine I wasn't trying to find a job there. I was just helping them with some capsule stuff they were putting on one of the boats before the circus boat to take it down to San Diego. So somebody had quit and they called me up and could you help us get this finished? And so I did. But when Hanover walked in, I was looking at some of the things they were doing on the boat and I thought, this isn't going to work, but what do I know? I don't know nothing about these things. I'm just a fabricator, flat bottom guy. How would, I never been to race courses. So what do I know? But when Hanover walked in, I knew him from limited racing because when I started was when he started about the same time. And he came in and he's talking about things. And so I talked for a while and then I says, hey, are you going to drive this boat over here? This pink one? Well, if Prevost isn't in the town, well, I'd probably qualify. I says, don't get in it. It's going to crash.
Oh, wow.
And
that's great.
And so, of course, you can imagine about 15 minutes later, Fran and Chip come out of the office and they're going, what do you mean? And I says, and other people are saying, well, you don't understand these. I went, you're right. I don't. I just have my opinion. I feel a fiduciary responsibility to tell somebody that I know that I think is a problem. And if it isn't, great, no problem.
Yeah. Yep.
They
That's
go down
awesome.
and crash the boat at San Diego. And of course, Fran and Chip call me up and say, could you come down and talk to Bennett? And I says, well, no, I don't think I want to get involved in those. I was running large sheet metal shops. I could race a boat, a flat bottom boat at the Budweiser level, and I could fly model airplanes. Life was okay if I didn't screw it up. And I'd listen to George Henley about, it taking over your life, and so I thought that had value. And so Chip and Fran said, they go, well, okay, well, thanks, thanks for taking the call. About 2 days later, I get a call from Bill Bennett of Circus, which is a little like about 8:00 at night. It's a little like getting a call from Bill Gates, he says, I understand you don't want to go to work for us. And I says, yep, that's right. And he says, you mind if I ask you why? And I says, well, Mr. Bennett, I find that unlimiteds are overexpected and underfunded to that name or to that goal.
Mhm.
I said, again, I told him the same thing. I said, I can do these other things in life. So okay if I don't screw it up. And he goes, okay. He says, I can understand that. He said, will you do me a favor? I didn't know, usually when somebody says, will you do me a favor? They tell you what it is, right?
Yeah.
But when you're a guy like that, they say, will you do me a favor? And my little computer whirred around fast enough to figure out that a guy like that you say yes to, you can always say no some other time. But I said, sure, what can I do for you? He says, I'll send a jet up for you. Would you come down, take a look at what I got there, come down, tell me what I need to do. Okay, well, I knew they had circus hobbies, so there had to be a free model airplane radio in this somewhere. I'm thinking, this right? And so I go down, I look at the shop, I take some notes, and I'd been in the shop for a couple of weeks to fix, some things on their boat. They'd wrecked some things, and they were trying to get capsules working and stuff, and they didn't have it really quite right. But anyway, so I said, okay, I'll do it. I go down and I look at the shop. I make some notes. He sends a jet up for me. And I thought it was kind of cool. I'd never been on a private jet before. So I fly down to Vegas. He puts me in the presidential suite and all of that. And I go into his office, and he had a little office, not, about the size of a bedroom. It was a typical old smoky, old mob type casino boss, super cool guy, a super friend of mine. But he came in and I said, well, here's what you need to do. You got one that's not competitive. You got one that's broken in two. You got about 5 motors, which like a half of one is any good. And you got 0 propeller program at all. You guys are running Mercury propellers. You put like $4,000 into them. By the time you get them done, maybe 6, depending on everything you do. And it makes it one heat. That's just not doable, at this level. I says, we got to come up with a better way. And so he goes, okay. And then he looks at me and he says, anything in town here you want to do? And of course, like I said, I hadn't been on a private plane or anything before. And I says, no, I'd just flown down on a Saturday to go through what I thought I needed to do in their program. And then he says, well, okay. He says, well, when do you want to leave? And of course, I'd never been on a private plane before. I says, well, I guess whenever the plane leaves. He goes, oh, hell, that thing will leave any damn time you want it to. Well, you said you flew model airplanes. And, I got a ranch out here, and I got a guy that is a caretaker and another guy that builds models for me. He said, we got plenty of airplanes. Would love to have you come out and fly some model airplanes. We're getting a little closer to that free radio, And so we go out there and we spend all the day. He doesn't say anything about boats. Talks about model airplanes and the casino business, occasional comment about a boat here or there, but he really doesn't. He's a smart guy. He doesn't focus on that at all. So we get done. It gets about 3:30 or so. And he says, hey, this guy will take you to the hangar. This guy, Donnie, I'm getting a little tired. I'm going to head home. He said, I really enjoyed spending the time with you. And I said, thanks, and I did too. He was a fun guy to be around. And so he gets in his car and I'm loading some airplanes into this van with a guy that works for him. And he comes by and he rolls down his window. He says, he says, I wish you'd reconsider that offer I made you. I kind of like you. You ought to think about that. And I thought to myself, I says, well, thank you. I enjoyed spending some time with you too. I says, I'll think about that. And riding back in the airplane, I went, I always said I wouldn't do that because it was overexpected and underfunded. What if it had a real program, So I told myself, I thought, this is scary, but I ought to, if I'm going to really regret it if I don't, take the opportunity to make the proposal. What I did is I told him, I called him back up. I gave it what I call the 24-hour soak. I think about it for 24 hours to see if I can talk myself out of it. Mm-hmm. And after that, I call him and I say, look, I thought about what you said. And I said, I'd be a coward if I didn't offer to go down and put you together a real proposal of 3 years of getting from where you are now, which is broken and not competitive, to beating Budweiser. He goes, hell, I've been trying to get somebody to do that for 3 years. He says, so have at it, let me know. And so I'm going, okay, here we go. So he said, I'll call him up and you can go down to the shop and spend all the time you want. I went, okay. Cause I just kind of went through, I knew some of the stuff that they had, problems they had, but I just kind of went through it, where this time I was pretty detailed to know, it needed a wind tunnel program. We needed to figure out how to do a propeller program, which frankly, other than I'd done some work with the Navy, was undoable. In fact, without the Navy, it was still undoable in 1988 because the private sector just didn't have the software or the arithmetic to crunch numbers fast enough to make the shape
Okay.
the way that we wanted to at the time. That's the long-winded of what exactly was wrong with it. But I went and looked over everything, and I called him up, and he told me at the end of it, he says, well, make sure you put in whatever you need for it. And I went, okay. Well, I'm sitting there going, well, chances are I'm going to get fired. I've never even been to the race courses. And so after I get fired after 6 months, and I'll at least get that, because that goes into a race or two before the year, because it was only 4 months from then. That was October sometime, and you had to run in March. So you didn't have much time to do this whole redesign, all of that. So anyway, so I go through all that, and I put together this program, this 3-year program, and I called him up. Like I said, I doubled my wage a couple of times in there, because I think, first off, I'm going to get fired, and I can't just go back to the sheet metal shop and hire me back to run these 50 guys in the shop. I'm going to get that job back. I'm going to have to wait for a while.
Yeah.
No matter what you write or guarantee a contract, you're still going to have to negotiate it again, run my price up a little, thinking that there's going to be some negotiation here. So I called him up and I said, hey, I got this proposal. And I said, do you want me to, they didn't have the internet. I said, do you want me to mail it to your office, or what do you want me to do? He says, you got a fax machine? And I says, yeah. And he says, well, just put it in that. I'll give you the number here at the house. And so I sent him it over, and like 10 minutes later, he calls me back, says, you got a deal. When can you start work?
Damn. Should have bumped him up some more.
Other journey. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I gotta run. My daughter's sick, so I just want to say, Dave, awesome having you on here. You had a great career. You're a legend. It was pretty cool seeing you race all these years. So, Brandon, I sent you the rapid fire questions for him.
All right, got
So
him.
you guys can ask them. So
There you go.
happy birthday, Dave. You guys have a good night.
Yep.
Okay.
Take care of the daughter.
See ya.
So yeah, so where did that lead? What was the first major, you were talking propeller program, but what was the major change that kind of started that team on that
It's
journey?
a long story. Like most of these things are. Like, I'll go back to the wind tunnel, because you asked about that. When we got this program, I said, well, what I'd seen was the shapes on these boats were wrong. And I'd been talking to Ron about what boats like pretty much today. And I'd paid attention to other mentors. Like, you see, Ed Carrollson was another big model airplane guy. So you could talk to him about some of the things. I'd spend days out talking to him at a model airplane flying field about why he was doing the shapes like Prevost's boat, the reason that boat had a little different shape than everybody, and when we'd been talking about that some, and Ed just did it in not the Ron Jones way, which is the coolest looking, roundest, most aesthetic way. When Ron built boats like everything grew there, and and they were beautiful. They were works of art, where Ed just kind of got it done. They'd be functional and they'd have all the same ideas maybe, but it wasn't quite as aesthetic. And so he had done some things to Prevost's boat that we'd been paying attention to, and Prevost had done some of the things that we had done. So, that taught us a lot. So when we put it in the wind tunnel, I said, looks like these boats are plenty fast enough. They just crash all the time. They were, entering the turn, everybody was crashing, and why do they run the boats downhill? Why do they do that? But I could tell by how everything was set up, they were. Well, we put the first wind tunnel model in, and really today's boats were designed in 1988, believe it or not, because we asked, a smart friend of mine asked a question. He told me, I asked him, hey, I need to build a model. Like, I got to get a run program for this. Is what we need to do with this. This was one of the NASA guys and another guy that just knocked on the door. But he said, think about this carefully. You get out of a dyno or a test cell or anything, any kind of a testing deal for anything you do, you get out of it the question that you asked for. So be careful. What question do you ask? If you ask the wind tunnel, can I make the boat really slippery and go fast? Which everybody that's paying the bill says, I want to make it faster because I'm going to pay a lot of money. I want the boat to be faster. And I explained to Bennett, and because he knew about the model airplane stuff and some of the people that we worked with that were building the models at Edwards Air Force Base and flying the models, we knew a lot about those shapes. And so when we asked the question, he says, look, we need to not ask the question how to make it faster. We need to ask the question, how can we make it more pitch stable? How can we do that? And what do we need to do that? So I went to a guy that was working in the wind tunnel for Boeing. There's a model maker that was a RC model guy, and went to him and said, here's what we need to do. So here's the base model. Here's the base drawing for like the Lucero boat that was there. And then we're going to put a Jones sponson on it. and then we're going to reshape it. But I want to build the model as it was with all the sharp edges and how that sort of the duck shoe sponson shapes or shear lines that everybody was running at the time. We need to do that, build that in the boat, but I want to build a section to take it on and off so I can see if we're doing anything. We put things in there to move the engine or move the cockpit back 2 feet because we knew the gearboxes could go back. And so let's move the cockpit back in, and just to find out what happened. We took the spar out of it and we put a full flying canard up there. We knew that would be a good idea, but thinking and knowing and know the whys and to know the numbers, a whole different animal, so we luckily asked all the right questions. The problem was in not building it. One, we didn't get a chance to build it. We built the 3-wing boat because we didn't understand, like with Glenn's boat, when they tipped over that canard boat, it bounced and it went up in the air and it got stable like it was supposed to. And it had a nose down pitching moment like it was supposed to. Trouble is, when it fell out of the air, it was 50 feet in the air.
Yeah.
So not very desirable. So the day I saw that, I went, okay, new program. Now we have to design the boat to be fast, blow over, but stay close as water as we can. Because it's going to slow itself down and tear parts of it. And so we kind of redesigned it. But the design was built that winter. And of course, like I said, we had 4 months to do all of this. So we just had to guess on the boat. I had to guess that I was right and then prove if I was right or not later. It turned out we were, and we're still running that stuff today. Really the same shapes and all of that is what we're using today. The propeller was something that I had a really high security rating around the Navy because we were building the Trident base and all of that stuff after I got out of high school. And so I was in the construction industry and we were building all these buildings. We built the Central Intelligence Facility. We built the Wright refit facility for the Trident submarine and the Wright refit facility. And all of those were aimed at bringing a submarine in under cover so nobody could see it wasn't on a dry dock at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Every Russian in the world could see exactly what that submarine looked like, and then we had, at the same time, it was in the Cold War. So we had a whole bunch of nuclear weaponry that was sitting out there at Bangor Base. And we had the contract to go in there and take care of all the environment around all of that nuclear weaponry. And so in order to stand up next to a live nuclear warhead that's ready to go down and put on a submarine, well, you literally can't have a parking ticket.
Wow. Yeah.
But that led us to a lot of things in the business because just look at the buildings I just said, Central Intelligence Facility, the Wright all the things that were super secret to the Navy at the time, which is where we got the contract. So when you made it to a higher level, if you worked in where the nuclear warheads were called the Swift Pack area. So, you took a Marine with you everywhere you went. But there would be 2 times a week, if you're working on a job out there, you'd have to go 50 stories down and play ping pong for half a day because there was a threat to the border.
Wow.
And so along with this, all this long stories to get to, I'm working in what's codenamed the model shop. And what that was is a development center for all the torpedoes. It was the David Taylor Research, which are all the smart guys in the Navy, the developmental guys. They were working on a torpedo there that was in the floor. And so I'm in there just putting some vent pipe on a CNC machine and another manual machine. And a bunch of white coats are around this torpedo. And they're talking about how it doesn't work and they can't hit a target and so on. And what they'd really done is they'd blown a hole in the water around the torpedo. They were using a Polaris guidance system to guide a sphere on the front of it. And for instance, you'd move the sphere to the left in order to make the torpedo go right. It operated inverse because they were attaching water, not fins, so they got less drag. The Russians had us beat at the time. And so we were developing a torpedo that would compete. It's kind of important in nuclear warfare that you get the other guy first.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting there and I'm watching that, and you're not supposed to listen and any of that. But for some reason, I felt compelled to go down. I could see some of the things because I knew how water worked around objects. And they were operating the first computational fluid dynamics at the time. They actually had those up and running in 1973. And so I'm listening to what they're talking about, but I'd listen to the model guys talk about the space shuttle too. So I'm sitting there looking at it going, okay, I think I know what's wrong with it. I said what they had done is they had they had optimized the shape too well. It was the computational fluid dynamics was attaching, it was blowing a hole in the water, reduce the drag, and then reattaching it right at the tail of the torpedo. Well, that's okay, except for that's in a perfect world. But in the other world, it has current, has, the water goes through different temperatures.
Yep.
There's all kinds of problems, and then just the guidance system of making it not hunt. But if you have something that is too well, it doesn't have any drag on the back of the torpedo, and so it doesn't want to steer. So I'm listening to that, and I get down and I walk over to the guy, the lab coat that has the clipboard, and I says, "I think I can fix your torpedo." And he looked at me, and I'm sitting there with my, nail belt on and tools in my around my waist, and he's in a lab coat, and he goes, "Really? What would you do?" And I says, "Well," I said, "I think you've optimized your shape too well. Your water isn't attaching till the very tail of the torpedo. So when it goes through current, then it won't have any guidance system." I said, "Every arrow needs a flue on the end of it if you want it to go straight." So I said, that might be the issue. I said, "I could probably reshape that little sphere for you there, but," I said, "I know you got a lot into this torpedo." He goes, "Yeah, about $500,000. This is like 1970. So I'm going, "Hey," I said, "I don't want to screw up your torpedo." He goes, "Oh, hell," he says, "you can't wreck it. It doesn't work now." He goes, and so I says, "Well," I said, "can you take that off of there?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, I can get that out of there in a minute." So I took an Allen wrench and they took the thing off the front. I walked it over to a vise and I hammered about 30 thousandths cup all around the edge of that sphere. It was like a 6-inch sphere in the front of that thing. And I hammered about 30 thousandths little cup into it. And the idea was in a real stupid way to get it to blow the water a little further out so it would reattach a little sooner and see what happens. And so I did that and I handed it back to him. And they put it on there and I just went over and I was picking up my tools to get out of there. And his name was Doc Peterson was the guy. He's probably not around anymore. But he says, "I got to know a guy like you would like to know what happened with that torpedo." And I says, "Yeah, Doc, but I know that's none of my business. This is in a whole different world that I'm supposed to not look or say anything about."
Yeah.
He said, "Just give me your number." He says, they ran everything at night back then. The satellites weren't good enough to look at everything. So every test they did, they ran it at night. In fact, we ended up putting all the listening centers in the Northwest for these torpedoes to lay on the ground to get ready to attack submarines walking in.
Wow.
A little dangerous for a mom and pop kettle in their Bayliner, but that's what you did. He said, "When do you leave?" I said, "Well, I leave like 4:30 in the morning. I usually go in and load up and then go to a job site, get back about 5, something like that." He says, "I'll call you when we get back off the water." He said, "It'll probably be around 4." And I says, "Okay." And so sure enough, about 4:00, he calls me up and he says, this all leads to your propeller question. He says, "David," he said, "I need you to come out to the base." And I says, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "I need to get you signed on to a little program with the government." And I went, "Well, I can't go to work for you." I said, "This is kind of a family operation. My uncle and my dad had left with one of the plumbers estimators that was Brown. And then the rest of us kids were sold to work at the business."
Yeah.
You probably understand that.
Yep.
So I said, "I can't quit because, I can't go to work for you. I can't quit there." He goes, "Oh no, you don't have to come out here every day." I said, "What do you mean? You're going to pay me, but I don't have to show up?" No. Guys like you, we just want to be able to talk to if we don't see something.
Wow.
I didn't know what consulting was or think tanks
Yep.
were, or anything. I didn't know anything about that. I was like 20 years old. And he says, you just see things differently than we do. And we like to have you guys around." And I went, "Okay." You got to remember, I made $115 a week back then,
Wow.
1970 something.
Mhm.
And my duplex was $100 a month furnished, and
Nice.
yeah. So I go and he tells me, "No, you don't have to show up here. I just have to get signed on so that if we have a question, we can call you." And I says, "Okay, so I don't have to show up. I don't have to produce everything every day. I don't have to fill out a time card, but you pay me?" "Yeah, that's it. Just answer the call.
Yeah.
If we have a question, we'll call you." "Okay." I says, "What does that sell or what does that pay?" And because I have no idea. He goes, 800 a month. I says, I'll be right out.
Yeah. I'm coming.
But later on, a friend of mine, I'd done some things, and it was just sheet metal layout, really. When we were developing some submarine propellers later on, we did some things that helped us get around the Cold War by presenting Russia with a whole different number of sound signatures that they hadn't anticipated. And it caused them to rethink war because
Wow.
when all of a sudden you imagine your workforce. I won't tell you all the details, but imagine a submarine force that multiplies by 5 times in 6 months.
Wow.
And that's not the worst part. You don't know what any of them look like. You don't know how fast they are. You don't know a lot
My
about
gosh.
them other than all of a sudden 5 times as many submarines showed up. Well, we did that with sound signatures and propellers and stuff like that.
Wow. So they
So
thought
I'd
it was
come up
5
with-
more, but it wasn't.
I'd come up with
Okay.
a sheet metal layout way to lay out a propeller, because before they were pitches and pitch blocks and
Mhm.
stuff like that. And one of the problems the Navy had was they'd design a propeller, but then they had to send it. One of their problems is then you sent it out to Michigan Wheel or somebody, one of the other vendors that you gave all your information to. Well, that was crazy. You didn't want to do that. We'd built a base to keep all this a secret. So then what we did is we developed our own way of building propellers in-house. So we built a big gantry CNC machine, which, had to be invented at the time and figure out how to build it. But once we did it, it's what got us to the end of that. So fast forward to unlimited hydroplanes. So I think I know how to do this. And I think the private sector's caught up enough. CNC machining's kind of taken off by then, right?
Mhm.
But I'm laying this propeller out and it post-process, but I can't get it to run a complete cycle of code. It's running into problems, and I know it was mathematic, but I'm not the smartest guy around. So I knew that was way over my pay grade, and neither did they. We had like 3 or 4 different software people that we had tried, but nobody could build a propeller. So I'm thinking, crap, I'm scratching my head going, this whole thing hinges on building that damn propeller.
Yeah.
I've got the forging, I've got through the other stuff and some of the processes. I could bore a hub in it, which wasn't no easy task for something that big. So I'd got all that, but I couldn't get a set of finished code. And so I'm sitting there and we're kind of at the end point where we're going, okay, well, we don't know what to do. We can't find anybody that can do this. And the guy that was working on is a close friend of mine, a brilliant guy and brilliant mathematician. It's one of those guys that'll calculate your speed before liftoff. He can tell you how
Yeah.
fast you're going before you leave and stuff like that.
Wow.
But so I call up, guess who? I know I'm screwed. So I call up Doc Peterson and I said, hey, Doc, I said, I know we can do it. I used the same layout to design the shape, told him how I was developing the surfaces and stuff, that was similar to what we'd done with the submarine.
Mhm.
So I haven't, but I said, I suspect the math can't crunch fast enough to move the cutter. And so when the machine sees that it feels like it's not in control, it sends it back to home, and so that's the problem, so how can I change the math on this? But I don't want to get you in trouble. I know that, that's a secret world and I don't want to get you in trouble. He goes, send it to my home address. Here's my home address. He says, can you get an editable floppy? They were floppies in the
Yep.
things. Can you get an editable floppy of it? And I says, yeah, I think so. So I had to go to the software guy, which was Tool Chest at the time. And I said, hey, I need to get need to put the stops off of this thing so I can go in and change some things. And he goes, well, what are you going to do to it? I said, can't tell you that.
Right.
I said, I think what I can give you back is something that apparently nobody else has. So I think it would behoove you if you okay us to do that. I'll look at it. And so I FedEx it to Doc Peterson. 48 hours later, I get another disc. We put it in, it works. But had I not fixed the torpedo,
Right.
would I never had that guy to
Never got that.
do the
That's
propeller.
a crazy story. That's a crazy. Dave, you're the beer company Dos Equis, however you say it.
Yeah.
You're like the hydroplane version of their most interesting man in the world guy. We need to get you a Dos Equis sponsor, Dos Equis, however you say it.
Yeah. Well, like I
That's
said, I've been
really cool.
lucky happen to be in the right places and happen to be, I always say the same thing. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, But this is like Glenn Davis, the guy that worked on the Atlas. I caught
Mhm.
him one day where I'd ask him some question. I'd have these questions because I knew he was the smartest guy I knew, or one of them. And so I asked him a question about something, and I could tell when I went over and I'm asking questions. I says, Glenn, I'm surprised. This is the first thing that I've ever asked you that you don't know. And he goes, David, he says, you don't have to be the smartest guy in the world, but you need his phone number.
I was about to say, if there's one thing I've taken from this conversation is when you get the opportunity to work with smart people, take it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
That's
that
really was my career, was happy to be around. I got to be around people that were, at the top of fields, and then you get to call people when you have a problem like what I just talked about, you know.
yeah. That's kinda where I really enjoyed when we built this Grand Prix. It's just looking at everything, obviously knowing you guys had done wind tunnel back in the day and just analyzing the unlimiteds and other boats, and then even cars started looking at things, and I was like, "We're missing something. We've changed skid fins, rudders, placements, everything, and these boats just they're erratic, they bounce around, they're hard to drive." So we just started looking at everything. Bobby and I talked a lot about aerodynamics and, like, trying to figure it out, and I'm like, what's the best thing to do but try to copy some of that stuff? And wow, it's like night and day. Everyone's starting to get nervous of me flying the boat, but I'm like, I have control. It's not like it's gonna just boom and blow over
The
backwards.
shape's a little better.
It's wild how much that little bit made a difference. That's really cool. And there's still more to go, I think, on our side of things. So
Yeah,
just keep trying.
a good example of like the shape on like what was the Winston boat, 1991.
Yep.
The boat they bought from us, it had a different shape. And one of the guys that had worked in a circus crew, this is like 3 or 4 years later, he was helping Lucero finish one of their boats and put new sponsons on it and stuff like that, and fabricate all the cockpit stuff and whatnot. Another sheet metal worker guy that worked on the circus boat and the Budweiser boat and Fred's boat and all of that. He's working on helping Lucero get a second boat running. They'd built a wider boat and whatnot, but it wasn't really working out. They were having trouble getting the boat to behave correctly and be drivable. And Lucero came up to, his name was Bub. Ron Horning was his name, but we called him Bub. Bub said, he came up to Bub and says, I don't understand why this old boat runs so well and the new one just doesn't. And Bub turned around and there was like 10 boats lined up there in San Diego. And everybody's trailers about the same and everybody's boats at about the same heights because everybody's copied everybody
Yep.
forever. And he looks and he says, just look down that row. And they looked down the row and you could see the nose of the boat. When I changed the deck shape of that circus boat, I had where the spar was, so I couldn't change that. So I just took and sprung a line down as far as I thought I could get away with and still have the boat not spear water when it went through, to
Mhm.
see. And it turned out it was a right idea, as we proved out later, but in the wind tunnel and in real. But he told Lucero, he says, look at that. You notice one thing different there? Well, you could see that the nose of the boat was down like 10 inches further down than everybody else's that had just clipped a Ron Jones sponson on it.
Mhm.
A whole different thing. Everybody was poo-pooing the Ron Jones sponson at the time because Lucero had been fairly consistent, but when everybody changed over to the Jones sponson, because the shapes were wrong, and that's what we proved out. And I wondered why everybody's running like a half a degree or a degree downhill. Well, as soon as the boat got to like a 1 degree positive, it was lifting like 7,500 pounds when the boat's only weighed 6,000. Well,
Yeah.
stuff went up.
Yep. Yeah, you can only
And so
control so much.
we shaped that, and that allowed us to fly the boats a lot more than people thought were possible. And like I said, we had moved the cockpit back and moved the spar back and all that stuff in the wind tunnel. The problem we had is the boats we were working on had an air trap that was made out of 17,000 skin honeycomb. So you knew the sponson, if you built it the way we're building them today, the sponson would fall off.
Right.
They didn't have the extra box beams in them they have now and different stuff that we'd learned, or actually Budweiser did. Budweiser, finally about 1995, they figured out the full flying canard. They'd move the cockpit back. They were sort of the precursor about 1994, 1995. The problem they had, like they were looking at that accident in San Diego where it was breaking the air trap.
Mhm.
So that's one of those pioneer projects. You knew it's the right thing to do, but how many do we have to lose in the mud
Yeah.
before we finally get one across the finish line? Who
Yeah.
wants? And that's why I didn't. I went, well, number one, we haven't got the time to do it. Number two, I'm not sure I know how to keep the sponson on these things. and neither did Budweiser. They went through, I think they broke the sponson off it 2 or 3 times
Oh, wow.
that year. One, I think, in Evansville, and one that they beat the sponson off at one time in Madison. I don't remember if that was the same year, but they beat the whole sponson off of it. And then they at San Diego, they're just sort of, Hanover was in the lead. I remember Danny on the radio was going, stop, 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 really, really, really bad, really, really, really bad, really, really, really bad. Because you watch it, it's like the whole thing just real time.
Just assume
It just disassembled itself into the water. Then when he came up, the cockpit was off. That's when we knew the cockpits needed to be reworked. Something had to happen there.
So now out of that, obviously you've won a lot of races, but thinking of rewarding as like learning and those things, out of the 10 owners you raced for, which one was the most rewarding as far as like learning the things or making changes?
Depends. I mean, Bernie was, I used to say I got Bernie at the right time. Bernie would do about anything I asked, and he put me, I had said no actually to him. They wanted me to go to work there. We'd won most of the races with Pico that year, and Bernie wanted me to go to work there, but I didn't think it was going to be workable. And I said, well, if you make me the team manager, maybe this could work, but I don't know any other way. And so that's what he did. And then it did work out, but I wasn't sure that was a combination that was going to live on. So, but Bernie, I got him at the right time. He was a wonderful person. He never, people thought he got up in the boat and said, we got to win this or anything. He'd go, like, I remember the first day I went down to test the Budweiser boat the first time. He called me up. We're riding down in the truck down to Seattle. And he says, hey, he says, you don't need to prove nothing. You've already won everything. Go enjoy yourself. Just go get comfortable with it. And don't worry about things. He wasn't, he'd come out like on a boat and say, this won't be the last boat race we ever get in. Do the best you can. Nice. He wasn't that way. Fred was a guy that Fred Leland, he was a guy that Fred and I machined. Fred built a beautiful brick house and ended up building one of his 5 liters in it, or what was in a 266, I guess, 5 liters in a 6-liter National Mod.
Mm-hmm.
He built one in the living room, had to cut the side of the building out to get his boat out. Alongside of the house, the boat was sitting in the middle of the recreation room, and the Bridgeport was sitting in the kitchen.
That's awesome.
He used it as a boat shop, and I would go over to Fred's because he had a Bridgeport, so I could go over and cut pistons and stuff over at his house because I didn't have one. And it was a little bit of a trip, but I'd help Fred with a couple of things over the years, and so he would help me, and so I'd known Fred for a long, long time. And after we got done with the circus thing, a second time around, and that's an example where people, you get in a certain time and place with the right kind of people, magical things happen. Sometimes they don't, And so when Fred gave me a call one day and says, this was after that we'd closed down the second circus thing because it wasn't working. The 2-wing boat was beating itself to death, and the other boat wasn't ready, and we're trying to make things work, but it just not working. And so then he just stopped. And I was going to go, I could go back and go to work for him again. But Fred called me up and says, what do you think about coming over here? I got these 2 boats built, but Fred would do exactly what you told him. He knew that I knew enough about the boats that, you walk in there, they give you Fred's boat and this idea. I walked up and I says, well, we need a lot more strut weight. And so, I got in and kicked the motor from the front all the way to the back of the engine bay. And I said, that's about right. 2 feet where nobody would have thought that was possible, but it was what it took. And, we won 2 races that year.
Wow.
With that against Budweiser and all of those guys, and then turned that into a bigger program and made the Pico thing work. But Fred, it was cool because Fred was the guy everybody laughed at. He was a guy that we called him first term Fred because most times out of 10, he'd be floating in the first turn, but he worked hard. He just wasn't very successful. So it was fun to get him to actually winning his first race in Seattle against Budweiser, Smoke and Goes, all of that stuff,
Yeah,
that was
awesome.
He is one that dedicated his life to the sport, and that's really cool.
He would you'd come up, you could come up with any idea that if you said, here, I think, what if we did this? And Fred would disappear into the machine shop and build something and, come out with it at 5 a.m. If the idea came up at 10 o'clock at night, he'd just work all night and make it work, And so he was cool that way to do things with somebody that's that serious about it.
That is awesome.
Yeah. And then Eric Elson was a great guy. I worked for Eric. we won a lot of races there too. I've been really lucky. A lot of these things happen with different people, and the same group of 4 or 5 people kind of follow you around. Like when I went to Fred's, and then it was a couple of months go by, and a couple of people call you up and say, "What are you doing out there?" I said, "Well, I've got some sponsorships for some propellers, and we're working this boat." And so they show up, and next thing you know, they're working there. And some of the same people you'd won, like at Circus, where we'd won a lot of races with Circus, guys you'd been in the trenches with,
Yeah.
week to week. That was back when we were running 10, 12 races a year with unlimited fuel and all of that. It was a whole
Wow.
different animal. But those same guys sort of followed around. Some of them are still like at BWR, working back at the Budweiser shop after being there. That was a different feel for,
Yeah.
not being in that place for a long time. Stuff literally, stuff like up in the prop room, stuff bushings or something I'd set up on a shelf from 25 years earlier. No kidding, no joke.
Holy crap.
One
That's
day I
crazy.
came there with a truck. I loaded some stuff from Madison to come out there on a truck. And I show up in the last hotel. I forget my razor. I leave it in the last hotel driving out there. And so I figure that out when I'm going to go take a shower in the shop there. And then the thought struck me. I went, I used to have a razor that I put in the office medicine cabinet in the upper right-hand corner. And I walked in there. Sure enough, right there.
That's
25
sweet.
years.
That's
Just blow the
awesome.
dust off and go to
Yeah.
it.
Literally. So it was kind of fun. It was fun. I quit racing boats really in like 2012 when Eric was getting where he'd done. I just kind of quit then. Ever since then, I've just been trying to help some people, try to give back, pay it forward to the sport a little bit.
Yeah. I think
You do
that's
a
one
great job.
thing we've noticed since then is like how fast you could jump in a boat and just whether you did changes prior to, but all of a sudden it flew differently or all these things, like you could tell that you had your hand in it. I mean, even this year with Sharky, I feel like that boat was aired out and it was just instant. Seemed
Had a
like you
different
were
look
one
to
with
it.
the boat.
Yeah. Well, like you say, you can make a canoe fast if you change enough shit on it.
Yep. No doubt. So I think that was a lot of tech. We're going to have to probably have you on for a second episode so we don't run too long here.
All right.
Obviously,
Cool.
it's your birthday, so you got to get out and have some dessert. But I wanted to know for the sport, obviously, you've went through so many errors of it. We talk about it here, and you went through flag starts because a promoter wanted to do that. What would your feeling be now that you're out of it to make it better? I feel like we have the most competitive class of unlimiteds we've had in a while. They're all pretty much the same speed. What do you think some major advancements could be going forward?
Well, I'll go back to Bill Donor. Donor was the guy, sort of the father of NHRA. I don't know if you know that or not, but Bill Donor was the guy that made NHRA. He's the guy that came up with the idea. He goes, let me see, I'm going to have Don the Snake Perdome and the Mongoose. And, he set up all of these. He gave people nicknames. He knew that he needed to have the drivers be, like Garlis did a show the other day, and he says, what you got to do is you got to put drivers' names in 6-foot letters.
Yep.
And not that the driver's egotistical, but the people need to know what the drivers, who they are, what they look like. Are they relatable? Like what I see in IndyCar, we don't have that big of a problem because we're diversified enough into age where people are older and younger. That's okay. And people have personalities and have something to say. But in NHRA still has that. They've done that well. But if you look at NASCAR, they got a guy that looks like he's still out of high school. He's not shaven yet. And he doesn't have much life experience, so he doesn't really have anything to communicate. Like the old NASCARs, the shucks, I was, we were drinking beer till 10 last night.
Yep.
Worked all night of it. That sport's turned into something that like the Gibbs racing deal. They have 500 employees. It takes $100 million to run that monster.
Yeah, it's like a Formula One deal now.
Yeah. And Formula One, the same thing. IndyCar, same thing. The drivers, I think the problem they're having with attendance, and if you look, and I know like some friends of mine, like the same guy, Bub, he went to work. I was going to go to work. I wasn't going to go to work for Budweiser. I was going to leave Fred. We'd won the championship. I was going to go. The IRL was just starting then. So they were building all of the pit boxes, all of the surface plates, all of the cars to get a fiberglass program up and running. And I knew the Penske people, and so did Bub. And so they were like, hey, we want to get you guys to come out here and do this. And so we're thinking about doing that. Well, Budweiser finally makes a better offer, and so we do that, and Bub and I went there for a year. But, the drivers in those 2 series, IndyCar and NASCAR, there's super talented, might be way better than anybody that ever drove those cars, but they don't have the entertainment value that a Dale Earnhardt,
Mhm.
Darrell Waltrip, Rusty Wallace, they had a lot of guys, and then a whole bunch of other names like Petty and all. I mean, those guys are just really interesting guys, and
Yeah.
that made us all wanna watch the whole thing, and then the cars weren't cookie cutter, they weren't so much the same, so and that happened in IndyCar too. I mean, you saw it, it sounds bad, but you know that out of 30 guys at Indy, that only like 5 to 10 tops have a shot at winning.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you'd watch those guys that you knew, like an AJ Foyt or an Andretti or a Mears or somebody. You're watching them to see, are they going to make it by the next pit stop? And can they get unlapped out of some mistake? And you're watching them pass other cars. The other cars are there for entertainment, but really
Mhm.
who you were watching was 5 to 10 people that you knew something about. And NASCAR had the same thing. We had 5 or 10 people. We'd watch the whole race to watch how they moved through or got shuffled back or something, where now all the cars look the same. You don't have anything to complain about. Like the Ford body is faster than the Chevy body, or the Ford head is better than the Chevy head, and all this
Mhm.
stuff to complain about. But now they just all look the same.
Yeah.
If you look around, there's nobody in the stands. Now, what's lucky for us on the plus side, the boat races still have a lot of people that are there. We do need to make the drivers relatable. What Garlic said ain't wrong. But you need to have something to say when you listen to the new guys in NHRA and the new guys in IndyCar and the new guys in NASCAR. They look like a 19-year-old that's got a PR soundbite. He's been beat to
Yep.
death into his brain, and he spews that out about his car and his sponsors, but he doesn't have anything interesting to say.
Yep.
He can't, he's so focused on that soundbite. I remember one time somebody asked me a question about Hanauer was driving the Pico boat in 99, and he'd beat me. I'd screwed up the start in Havasu, and so he'd won the first race. So the next race was Barrie, Ontario, and they say, the guy comes up and he asks me, he says, so, Hanauer beat you the last time. What are you going to do? I says, well, I'm going to kick his ass. That's what I'm going to do.
Exactly.
That's my priority here. And back then, and it still happened, it's the wokeness of what they were. They said, oh, you can say butt, you can't say ass.
Yeah.
We're calling in
course.
Budweiser and saying, oh, he's got a foul mouth, and and I went, but that's what people did that made it entertaining, that made it drew us to it. Were those
Exactly.
personalities. And I was looking at old, and this is a critique on ourselves, looking at old boat films of old races from ESPN, and you see the guys, even when all the boats weren't fast, but the drivers were entertaining as hell. Like Ron Snyder, Madison, he put a Miss Piggy nose on, and he said, I got a nose for racing, and they're having a good time, and just stuff like that. He thought of something that was entertaining, and it gave the show value. Maybe entertains people and brings them back.
Makes
If all of
sense.
our problem is the boats are same, they all look the same, that's bad. The asset is all the boat looks the same. They're probably better designed than, we've got to the end, to answer your question about design, we've got to the end where, from what I know and in my experience, either I've just run the gamut that can't come up with anything better.
Mhm.
We've come up with control systems. Like when I went to Budweiser, they had a great design. They didn't know how to use the control system.
Okay.
So I came up with the pedals and a set of springs out of my super stock that happened to be the right ones. Sometimes you just have to get lucky.
Yep.
And that was one of those times where I put, I give like the Budweiser boat. I tested it the first time I take it out. It's running like 190 miles an hour. And I told him, I said, just set it up how you guys set it up. You guys are plenty good enough. Just set it up how you would set it up, and we'll go run it. And then I'll unlock some things. And I had that dual pedal in there and stuff like that. I said,
Mhm.
I'll unlock some things and I'll do it how I would set it up, and I'll put my propeller on it. And we're there testing in Seattle. So we're running like 190, and I forget what the lap time was, but we run like 8 miles an hour. I changed the propeller. I unlocked the canard so I can use the pedals, and I run 8 miles an hour faster. Then we're running 200. They go, wow, we haven't seen 200 in a long time.
Yeah.
Yep. We didn't have RPM restrictions. Well, maybe we did. We did have RPM restrictions then, but
Okay.
we had 4.3 gallons per minute. So we could run Like when I set those 173-mile-an-hour records, we're running like 204, 205, for a period.
Now,
You
was
actually
it
need to
a
turn.
lot of the fans always see that top mile per hour? Did you feel any difference from doing 190 now or whatever where it topped out at now?
Oh, it's way different.
It is. Okay.
I went by in Fred's boat. I went by the yacht club in Detroit there one time. I'll never forget this because I was one of the first time we'd run the boat, and I'm whistling on through, and I'm going down the yacht club, and I kind of looked down because you didn't have digital cashes, and you just had a
Mhm.
Keller speedometer. And I looked down and it says it's just on the north side of 215, like 217. And I went,
Holy crap.
"Ooh, better pay attention. This corner is going to come right up." But that's what they would, back then we didn't have any RPM limits.
Right.
And so, I mean, we ran the same limits we ran now, but we had back when I was doing that, we had 4.7 gallons per minute. It was the first couple of years that we ran the restrictor. We
Wow.
ran 4.7 gallons per minute, and we could run faster, than you do today. They were still workable, and we didn't have any RPM limits, but that's why I was running 217. But I looked there and went,
True.
wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty fast.
Yeah, that'll get you
I think
going.
that'll do it.
So back to the characters in the boat racing. I feel like they're there. You just got to bring them out of their shell. Did you embrace the villain role that sometimes got pushed on you? Did you just like, yep, whatever, I don't care?
I got sold both ways. I got
Okay.
sold when Donor came in. He knew I was the guy that was from the unfunded team,
Mhm.
but he knew that I would do something with it from the history he'd seen before. And so, they liked to, that's where he came up with the name 6'6". I wasn't 6'6", but that's what he told everybody. What he said. And so him and J. Michael Kenyon was his promoter guy for NHRA. And back then, like I say, back then a prize money payout was like 30 grand. And the reason it was, I tell them that's a lot. They don't pay attention to it a lot, but back then, Budweiser, Winston, Circus, Miller, they paid into a points fund that helped pay for the TV, and it helped pay for the office. It helped pay for the secretaries and publicists and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Then somebody decided that we'd have a welfare system where we'd pay everybody the same. And then they just started taking
Dwindling.
everything out. And that's what some of the competitors would say. Good example of this is like buoys one year. But they would always say, well, how are we going to cover the cost of a new safety boat or, the equipment we need to buy? And they'd always stand up, take it out of the prize package because they figure it's going to hurt Bernie worse, right?
Right.
Everybody would say that,
Wow.
And one day we're sitting there, we're talking about new buoys. We need new buoys. And myself and Tate were on the board of directors, which they had 2 drivers, which is something they need to do.
Mhm.
We had the board position. So you had 2 owners, 2 race site, 2 drivers, a crew chief, and then a couple of people at large that were supposed to be people like Buddy Byers the Chrysler connection. So you put him on the board. So he'd go find the money for the Gold Cup every year.
Okay.
And he would, but that's how it was. So when we had problems and we learned different rules, we would beat them to death, that we'd beat those rules to death. That if there was a problem, a bunch of smart guys were spending a lot of time through the year to beat the problems out of it before everybody ever got to somebody on a board that doesn't know anything about it, doesn't know how fuel controls work or why boats stay up right side up. They're interested in the sport, but they don't understand the technical part. But the crew chiefs and the drivers would get together, and if they could vote to pass something, then we'd sell it to the owners to, that we'd put it in pretty good form, that we felt we had a pretty good compromise, something that would push the sport forward. But, that it was that group that put it together. We don't have that anymore. They have
Right.
meetings, but they don't really, we beat all the issues to death because you had a bunch of smart people that were in there going, this isn't going to work and this is why. I
Yeah.
told Kelly that I said, Kelly and somebody else had came up with that 80 mile an hour rule. And I went, that's never going to work. Somebody's go under it. And then it's going to be, you don't have the winners, not the winner. And their answer was, oh no, drivers will just have to stay over 80. I says, okay.
Good luck. Good luck.
Just like with you guys with your HRL, I remember, I don't know what year it was. I was at an APBA convention and they were sitting in there and the Canadian guys were trying to tell the APBA APBA is trying to tell Valleyfield that they needed to run the same start there to run the national championships.
Mhm.
And all that Canadians were sitting in the back of the room on one bench with their folders, their legs or their arms folded on their chest. And then I forget who was the commissioner at the time, says, "Would you consider us changing that?" And they just got up and says, "No." And sat back. So I think what could be done in the sport, and I've said this to powers that be, but what I hate is this is what Donor came in, and that's why I brought his name up. He saw the problem with the sport, and in his words, he says, "Why do the referees have to be so goddamn officious?" I said, "Well, Bill, they have all kinds of rules, and you're trying to run the infield, you're trying not to run over somebody, you're trying not to go too fast or too slow, and trying to get position, and it gets complicated. And the more competitive it is, the more complicated it gets, you know?" And so he came up and says, he just wanted the race to go on and the winner to be the winner. He's a promoter. He was a track guy and a sport guy. And so he said, we need to have a flag start and we need assigned lanes. Did it work perfect? No. It was hard to get the flag start. The good thing about the flag start is you usually have to go around a couple times. So the water got rough. So the guys in the inside wasn't as in good a shape getting to the first turn. A lot of times he did something big enough in the first turn that he wouldn't get through it. And so it changed things up a little bit. But they first did it off a flag start, and they did it off of like drag racing would. The fastest time or the most points got first choice, and so on all day. And that worked for a year or two. And then when I got with Fred's, I managed to get Hanauer and Tate into a position where they were racing each other, and they got screwed up on the start. I got around them and got lane choice the rest of the day, where most of the people in the most unlimited slot, you can't beat them. They have too much money. They have too this, too that. They'd kind of resign themselves. Like people say, if you think you can't, you surely can't. If you think you can, you got a shot.
Exactly.
And so they got behind, and I got lane position, and I won every heat and won the final. And so we went, we need to have it so that we swap it around, kind of like what you do in the HRL. Trouble was I screwed that up because we managed, when I finally went to Budweiser, we were able to optimize a few more things that I hadn't had time to optimize for Fred. And so we were running fast enough, and the competition, there was only just our Budweiser boats. Everybody else was at a different level in terms of how the boats were shaped, how they were controlled, all of that. And so it was pretty hard to beat us. So I could win from the outside lane pretty consistently. So then we decided, okay, go back to clock starts and fight for lanes. And then it turns into the same thing. It's a mess every time, where Donor just wanted something that was orderly.
Yeah.
That he could have somebody win the race. And I think that's what you guys have done there with the Grand Prix race and the HRL. You've made it at least orderly. So, and if it's orderly, then you have a better shot at making the start, correctly. And we knew that from the flag starts or not the flag starts, but the, assigned lane starts. You could hit the line and not jump the gun more often, to where with any type of a fight for lane or a park and start or any of those drivers here put in positions where they can't predict.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
Earlier,
so
like you said earlier, it's hard to predict in an unlimited that time and distance, or is it going to take off? Like, it's a little bit different even in those for fighting for lanes.
And that easy. And people look at me and they go, well, why don't you push the clock more? And they says, well, one of the reasons I've won a lot of races is, back when I started racing, always cumulative points. So if you jumped a gun anytime during the day, you certainly lost. So it paid to, even if you got 2 seconds, a guy that got a first and a fifth maybe didn't beat you. So, but you didn't jump. You didn't.
Yeah, that's for Kyle and I. We've been getting beat on all year because we've been late on starts. Me and the Grand Prix, him and the 2.5. But in HRL, you actually have an extra points penalty if you jump the gun. You can only max out at 8 points first 25. So it really could ruin your weekend. It could ruin your season. So it's kind of like when you got a little bit of an advantage, give up a little bit there to make sure you can get the rest of the laps in and maybe run them down.
Well, and even if you don't, that's something I learned by, like I said, watching. I would watch how Hanauer would approach a race, and I would watch how Deeth would approach a race. I was paying very close attention to what they would do. And you could see that Hanauer's a good friend of mine, and he was a great, great boat racer. But I could see he would throw the race away to get an inside lane off of somebody. He'd go up there at 5 miles an hour if he could. Where you could see that Deeth he'd go up there at 5 miles an hour if he thought you could get you alongside him at 5 miles an hour. But a lot of times he'd go up and give him a good head fake, get somebody there and then go out and make a start at full song. So there's a lot of that, a lot of these races decided that way, which is, it's good for the racing part. And for us, I think it's fun to do that. But I also know if I put my promoter's hat on, it really sucks that 2 or 3 people jump the gun half the time. And the crowd and the announcers don't know. We have a different thing that I'm watching evolve in the sport, which is we go back and we watch tape for so long before we make the call. Nothing against Jonathan. He's trying to do the best call he can. But if we run an NFL game, we can't wait for every play and then go look at the video and then come back for the next play because the game doesn't flow that way, and things change. So the referees, I think, need to make calls. We need to have some sort of orderly lane deal. I don't know what it is, but something that's not what we've done before, but something that works. And then at the same time, the referees need to make the call. Make the call. We can change it later, but make the call so the race plays out as you think it does. If you're wrong, that's okay. That doesn't happen all that often, really. Referees are pretty good all around. But if we sit and watch tape long enough, we can almost disqualify anybody for something. I know
for sure.
You could
Just see hydro sim, man. That's where it really shows up. When we go back and scrub it across every moment of the race.
Like Noonan used to be, both the Noonans used to be, I thought they were kind of hard ass on people, but they weren't really. What they were doing is training. They knew the boats were big, harder to handle, and they knew that somebody back when they got started, somebody was sitting in an open cockpit. So if somebody cut them off, they might die. So it's kind of important everybody held their lane and they not be too close and they not move in or move out. And so you could see that he would be really hard on new guys. Noonan would. But after a while, I went, oh, I see what he's doing. He knows that he's trying to train everybody to make sure and stay in their lane, not go out too far, not pinch somebody too much, all that sort of etiquette stuff that he would keep in check. And back then we'd qualify if somebody got 5 feet away from somebody, and back then it was 15 feet, not 10. If somebody got 10 feet away, you got a $500 fine.
Oh, wow.
A $300 or $500 fine that you got too close. They wanted to tell you, then they started taking away some points on that, but not enough really. And then if you did that twice, then you got a lap penalty. So you'd get a penalty for getting too close to somebody or moving out too much on somebody. And so then you had to really pay attention because you had to go a couple of races before you got off of that, got out of that penalty box.
Wow.
So every time you screwed up, then it was, you probably weren't making the final because you got a disqualification or a lap penalty, depends on what it was. That's a problem. So I think you need to come up with something that has some sort of an assigned lane that has reversal in it, even though the guys that don't think they can win, they really can. They just don't know it yet. I remember when I won the first race for Fred, we'd got lane choice. And Fred asked me before we go up to pick the lane, he says, what lane are you going to take? I says, I'm taking lane 2. He goes, what do you mean? You take lane 2, you're fired. Okay. So I went there, I took lane 2, came back, and Fred says, what lane did you pick? I says, lane 2. He says, you better make that work. And of course we did. But, we knew the boats would get around that rough water. Chances are we'd, do well from there, and we did. So something like that has a lane. But at the same time, another problem we have that we haven't bumped into yet is, we bumped into this. We set the RPM. This goes back to 1990, 1989. People thought you couldn't run a motor in a turbine more than 100% because that's what they did in a helicopter. They ran at 100%. Anything then more than that was overspeed, and they didn't like that. Well, so I go up to Butch, who's the guy who put the work out of the Army, and I'm thinking valve float, right? Because I'm a piston guy. I'm thinking, how fast can I rev this thing?
Yeah.
And what happens when I do? Where does the torque fall off? And turbine guy tells me, well, the torque is never going to fall off. So you can run it as high, but you can't take it by 120% or we have to tear it down. That'll stretch the wheel. And I went, okay, 120 is valve float.
Yep.
How do I design something around this? And so one of the advantages besides the propeller and the boat shape was we were running the motors. We weren't putting as much heat in them because we weren't putting as much gear in them, but we were spinning the motor up and we kicked in the governors. So it would kick in about 117%. I did that back
then when we didn't know how to adjust anything. We really didn't. It
Mhm.
wouldn't have been for Butch helping some helicopters out of the fire in Yellowstone. We wouldn't have got the help to understand how to work the fuel controls because nobody knew, other than a few guys at Ham Standard. So you had to know the right guy,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
get the right information. But I think if you had something right now, what we're doing is we're overspeeding the engines. We're not helping them. We're overspeeding them. Before we wanted to make it so you didn't overspeed it. So now what we're doing is we're running it right up to where we shouldn't be running it. But instead of doing it one time a lap entering the corner, we're doing it 3 or 4
That's all
times
right.
a lap down the straightaway. Well, that's not good. If we're trying to save money by not spinning parts too fast, which is a good thing, you should not do it multiple times.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if we could easily set a device up that it would do 2 things. We could set a device which would be like a Y harness in the fuel system. You
Mhm.
have the fuel comes into the engine and one Y's off to a fuel shutoff, another Y's off to an orifice. And if I was doing it, I'd do it low tech. So in other words, I'd find an orifice at like 600 pounds of PSI would only flow like 3.8 gallons per minute.
Mhm.
Not where you shut the guy off, but you just seriously neutered him
Reduce
for a
them.
while. And you make it that way for 20 seconds or 30 seconds. I don't know what the number is, but long enough that if somebody that exceeds the RPM, it's going to,
That makes sense.
the same data acquisition we had would shut off a valve and force the fuel through a fixed orifice that would lower them down. It doesn't have to be perfect. It could be anywhere between, I'm going to guess 3.5 and like 3.7.
Mhm.
So you don't care what it really is because you're just under the penalty box for like 20 seconds. So if you spin the motor too fast, instead of coming back and disqualifying somebody after the race is over with, and we all look like idiots, including the driver, the crew, everybody looks like idiots, and we look like we don't know how to run a boat race. If you just had a limit like that, well, now the penalty is done in real time. Well, if he won the race, well, he still won the race. He might have had to back off a bunch of times, and his boat was fast enough that he still couldn't be passed at 3.7. But what the heck? I didn't have to throw the flag here on the beach.
Yeah,
And you
I'm
do the same thing.
100% for that.
The same device that you put in the for the RPM. If you had that same valve wired to the same computer, if you go over 4.2 for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, or I don't care what the number is, just pick one.
Yep.
Whatever the
Same for
number is,
everybody.
you go over it, and then it shuts your fuel down to that same 3.5, 3.7 for like 20, 30 seconds. So if you exceed fuel, you pay the penalty right then. You may win the race and you may not, but at least we
Yeah.
don't have to go back at the beach and say, sorry, you're screwed.
Yeah, anything to get rid of that. I'm watching the live streams and then they're like, "Hold on, we got to go to the tech shed." I'm like, "No motorsports in this world does that. Like if NASCAR, if it doesn't fit the body, they're thrown out like that night or the next day. Like you don't do that to the fans where you're holding them hostage. After that final, they should be like, "Woo!" chug their beer and gone."
Yeah, and certainly, after the race is over with, the fans picked up their bags. We gave somebody the win,
Mhm.
and then we find out a half hour later, we looked over tape and they went, well, actually, this guy cut this guy off here a little bit too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to write some things that drivers will make mistakes, referees will make mistakes, just like we've done in baseball. The next pitch, you don't get to complain about it. That's it. The
Yeah,
next time you snap the football, you may have had a point. The referee made it completely screwed up, but it doesn't matter. So if you set the deal to tell a referee, make the call. And then if it's
You win
wrong,
some,
well,
you lose some. That's
you
it.
win some and lose some. But if you don't make the call, you only get like a half a lap to just think about it.
Mhm.
You don't get to go over and watch video for a half hour to
Yeah.
come back because the race can't, and then the announcer can't. I'll use like my case, and they had no idea what was going on in the Gold Cup.
Yeah.
Total
That's hard
cluster.
to watch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was painful. And listening to Tanner Faust, that's never been around our sport, I'm like, this is hard for him. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they don't know, but I know what they were doing is, and this happens to me more than, one thing I don't miss about it. They'll sit and look at things for 1,000 times to see if I did anything wrong.
Yeah.
So they were making sure that there wasn't anything wrong there.
Yeah. They tried everything.
Yeah.
You said
they
something
spent-
earlier that I wanted to expand on just a little bit. You said the penalty being in real time. And I think in a lot of ways that's the key is you don't have to go back and after effect. One thing that we've thrown out here, and we haven't talked about it in a while, but I feel like gun jumps, if a guy jumps the gun by the 2 feet or the tip of his sponson. What are your thoughts on time penalties that aren't, 1 minute where you're out of the race? Maybe it's 3 seconds.
I'll say something first about I remember I was on a tech committee and we were trying to decide how do we keep the minimum speed up so that we're not doing the park and start. And people are talking about strobes and devices and stuff like that. And I'll give Charlie Grooms something that he came up with that was a brilliant idea. He saw it as it's overly officious. If we have something where we're like what we did with the 80 mile an hour, we're officiating it later, or it's, if a strobe goes off and we have to throw somebody out because a strobe went off, that's also a problem because they were talking about that. He says, how about we just make it so you got to have a rooster tail? It's about the size of the wing and that's it. About the height of the wing. And I thought after that was done, I went, you know what? That wasn't a bad plan because we're not going to throw somebody out after they get back to the beach or, it's hard to be definitive and we just don't want to go back there. But the truth is when we said you had to keep your boat on plane, then people started arguing about how on plane it was.
Yeah.
And I think a referee can decide if the boat settled into the water. When my uncle raced, I remember he got tossed out one time because the transom touched the water. Back then,
Wow.
the boats were just made out of like 1/4-inch plywood. So if the water got rough, the boats all blew up.
Wow.
So they were really, really strict on, at least in the Northwest, that the boat has to stay in a prop riding attitude. So you could
Wow.
jog or do whatever, but you couldn't slow down. He slowed down someplace and drug his transom. They came in, nope, disqualified.
Wow.
That's how it was.
Wow.
And so
That's interesting.
you could, if the referee just said, look, I don't care. You guys were pushing water for 20, but you hadn't just settled into the water. So you give them that. Well, now it's less officious. We're going back. That's a pretty wide deal. Now, all you guys are going to bitch about it over and over and over. But the truth is, if you just kept it that way, you could still probably run a fight for lane start. But because as we went down that rabbit hole of putting a Band-Aid on a Band-Aid, it just got worse and worse and worse. And then we're throwing people out and everybody's mad at everybody. And
Yeah.
why would you go to a race if it wasn't any fun?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where you get thrown out after the fact, after you've had a good 5 minutes of your day, like Dale Warrington used to say. He says, the only fun in unlimited racing is the 30-second it takes to get from the start line back to the pits. Everything before and after is work.
It's a pretty good quote.
Good one.
But I think if we had something on there that we could control, that we knew that somebody, you're not trying to be, I think putting the flow restrictor in that old Kate's restrictor we had, everybody thinks I have some way to cheat that. I don't, but I know if I put a mechanical device that, let's say we're supposed to run at 4.2. If I set that mechanical device at 4.25, and I know because I ran a lot of those and tested a lot of them. For instance, if you're 4.3, I know what happens in 4.3. If you're at 4.3 and you overpressure the restrictor, it controls the fuel back to 3.999 gallons per minute and stays there until you reset it. When the spring resets, then you could go. So if we set something that was set at 4.25, then it's another way to do this device. You have the other device. The trouble is, it's computer controlled. So if somebody can figure out how to cheat the computer, then that's a problem. What is nice to have, if we had a Kate's valve in the line that we could set it at like 4.25 over where you're supposed to be. But if you bump into it, it's going to reset it. So you may have gone over, but
you hurt
if
yourself.
you hurt yourself probably at some point. You still won, then we'll worry about that later. Maybe you'll put up with a fine or you say, look, if you do that again, then you're disqualified for the next, you get this many points taken away. So you do something that makes at least the top 4 or 5 guys not want to do it.
Yeah.
Something like that you could do. But if you had a mechanical device in there, like I said, I know how the device worked. So as long as you didn't screw with it and it didn't allow it, we had all kinds of bypasses and whiz bangs and whistles that we had learned how to cheat it because they let us. We didn't actually cheat it, but you could get more out of it. You could get like a couple of hundreds more out of that if you tuned it just right. Like I remember with Fred's, we didn't have a dyno or nothing. So I ran the bypass up in my seat and I'd adjust the fuel control sitting in the seat going down the fairway until I got to, we didn't have any gauges or computer was working. So I just had one gauge, which I know is connected to the fuel, right? So I just keep adjusting. I ran the line from the fuel control up to a bypass and I keep adjusting it in my lap with a
Oh my gosh.
Allen wrench. And then once I got at the peak, then I just got out of the gas, took the Allen wrench out and set the screw on it so it couldn't change, and then went back to the clips and put it back on the motor. You know, that
Nice.
was a poor man's way of making Fred's deal work because we didn't have a
Yeah.
battery yet. We hadn't got
There
that.
you go.
But I went, I can still figure this out. I'll do it the analog way, but I'll figure it out. But then they saw that we were doing that and they went, that's illegal. You can't do that.
That's
Now,
awesome.
lucky for us, we got 3 motors set already, so screw you.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Kyle, I think you want to do the rapid fire? We'll go ahead
Yeah.
and do rapid fire. Dave, it's been awesome having you on. We'll do rapid
My
fire
pleasure.
questions. Basically, it's just quick answer quickly. And then we'll wrap up at the end here. But if you're willing to, we'd love to have you back on. We enjoy your insight on the sport, all these cool stories. I'm sure our fans would love to have you back on. So sometime later in the year. Heck, maybe you need to be our H1 analyst after each event. Tell us what went wrong, what went right.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Well, you guys got your boat about, looks like you guys got your boat about ready to go. That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah, it's
Getting there.
getting painted Thursday, so it's cool. Definitely way ahead of schedule from last year.
We made that, we dropped a sponson off a T6. I forget what year. It was like 2000 something. We broke a sponson off a T6. Well, we took T3 out of show duty. And we built some parts for it over the week because I had some ideas of stuff we hadn't tried to optimize with that boat. But we made that boat run within a mile an hour of the other boat.
Wow. Yeah.
Sure, it doesn't have that stuff on there. There's, like, I knew there's a set of sponsor runners sitting in the bud shop. They're stuff that I put on it, and one's what I ran on the boat. But
Okay.
somebody has changed that out. And so-
Yeah.
Call Bruce Brandon. Get a hold of those. Oh. All right,
Anyway,
I got like
okay.
5.
You
I think it's 5 to 8 questions. So just nothing crazy, simple, and just kind of answer off the top of your head. So if you had to go back and race all over again, but you could only race one class or one category, flat bottom or hydro?
I'd say flat bottom. There's a lot of memories there with a lot of different people. And that's because of the people. I quit racing a long time ago. For me, I'd done 30 years ago, I'd done everything I wanted to do, so then I started racing for the people that were around me. And I knew I could contribute something somebody else couldn't. Anyway.
All right. What was your favorite decade to race in?
Oh, geez. 2 of them, really. Like I said, it was that group, that circus group was a special group. We'd done some things that happened. And then in the 90s, what I didn't say about that Seattle win was that we'd blown the sponsor. We'd got the boat fast. We'd finally got the steering figured out and got some other things because that boat had never gone that fast before. See, it was going like 20 miles an hour faster than it had ever gone. So steering wasn't working, bearings weren't working, and things like that we had to get fixed up. But by the time we got around to Tri-Cities, we could run with Budweiser. Trouble is, it punched a hole through the front of the sponson and blew the whole sponson off. Danny and I laid in fiberglass for 3 days and built the sponson and put it on. Got to the pits by Thursday. We got there Thursday about 3 in the morning. I guess Friday, 3 in the morning. Slept under the truck and started qualifying the thing and ended up winning the race.
Wow.
That's
But-
awesome.
That's cool.
Those are the most
and
rewarding
part of
ones
that
there.
group, I talk about people. We were going through that we'd got the boat fast, and then to the driver, I'm going like, crap, we can't keep this thing together. It's just every time I got it fast, but parts keep failing. It's
Yeah.
not ready to go that fast yet. And so when we got over there and we could run with the Budweiser guys, but then the next thing I know, the sponson blows a hole in it. So then we're back at Seattle. We get there. We work extra hard so we can play the slow pitch game against the NHRA. That was more important than anything in the whole week. Play softball with John Force. And
Cool.
so we got that done and made it and showed up, like 3 or 4 in the morning. Then we go out and run the boat. Next thing that happens is something in the gearbox fails. I'm sitting there going, crap. I'm bumping into a problem every time I turn around here. This stuff isn't ready to go this fast, Dan comes up with a piece of tape, and this is before the Mariners, the baseball team up here, coined the phrase "refuse to lose." Well, they got it from us because Danny came up and he put a piece of tape on the locker in front, said "refuse to lose." We still got them right where we want them.
There you go. Nice.
That's awesome. All right. Coors Light or Budweiser?
I like both of them, actually. I think Michelob Light's probably one of my favorite Budweiser brands. The Coors brands were good too. We got used to a lot of Budweiser, though. We had lots and lots of free Budweiser.
This one might be a tough one. Over all your years, what was your favorite boat that you drove?
Oh, geez. I mean, we had a lot of wins. Eric was one of them because that was a special boat. But then Fred's boat, we called it Lucky for a reason. You know, that was a boat that was a narrow boat, and you know, it was the old design with the full spar and the cockpit forward and stuff. But we did a lot of magical things with that. And sometimes it's just mind over matter with these things. You just keep your head in the game and keep yourself in there, and good things happen.
Yeah, I go. Steak or chicken?
I like steak, but I've eaten a lot of chicken. That's why I'm still walking around.
Who was your toughest competitor? I know we kind of already touched on this one a little.
Well, like I say, Chip was one of them. You know, like I say, Steve David put up a good fight. Theo Rat was probably one of the toughest to race against, one of the toughest guys to race against. But then he had a set of, you know, things that, you know, he would be a little easier to beat than other people just from so many things going wrong.
Yeah.
But really a hard boat racer, you know?
Yes, kind of beat himself for you sometimes. Out of all courses you've raced, what's the most challenging race course?
Well, Detroit's the most challenging for speed. This is the most challenging to survive the race. I mean, there's no race I was ever more worried about than Madison, because if there's 4 or 5 people there, it's not as big a deal. But when there was 12 people there, one screw up, you're out.
Yep.
Wow. You know, 4 people are only going to start in the front. You know, any big screw up is going to put you out of the race. So it's just one race that you cannot mistake. That's why your Gold Cup's going to be pretty darn interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun one. Last one. Can I have your autograph?
Anytime.
Dave, I want to say it's been a big pleasure having you on. I know a lot of people have waited for this episode for a long time. I don't think there's very few that we can say are as true of a legend in this sport as you. I know it hasn't happened yet, but congratulations on your induction into the Motorsports Hall of Fame. And I didn't know this, but I wish I could say I'm surprised, but thanks for helping us beat the Russians, man.
That was good. They called a whole meeting on that. It was one of those times where Doc Peterson says, we're going to have a convention here in Seattle, and we're going to talk about what to do about our deficiency in numbers. So think about that, you know, and come over. So I sat and listened to brilliant guys talking about carbon fiber submarines, Kevlar submarines, all of that stuff. That's where the propellers came from, as we said. I watched everybody. Nobody really had a good answer. We didn't know where we're going to build them. How are we going to keep them secret? How are we going to, if we put them in any of the construction places in the country, covering them up, could be done. You know, that was a challenge. And time was a challenge. So when we came up with what we did was we built, besides that torpedo, we built 5 propellers for each one of the submarines. Then what we did is we took the submarines and ran them up into the Banger, which is way inside the inlets of the area. If you knew Seattle, you knew it's way back in where those bases, as far back as you can get away from the Bay areas where, you know, enemies could be. And so what we'd do is we built all those propellers over about 6 months after we got the machine running and programs working and all that. We built all those machines. And what we would do is we'd run a submarine in the canal and into the base. Then we put it in the right refit and haul it out so that we could get the propeller off it. Well, then we put a different propeller on it. We drop it in the water so the Russians couldn't see it. So you drop it in the water and you send it up to the Bering Sea and let them get a good listen. Then we come back, put a different one on, send them up, let them listen to it. Well, can you imagine if you're the enemy, and all of a sudden your chief enemy, all of a sudden in 6 months has 5 times as many submarines.
Yeah.
They all have. And what I told the admiral or the admirals in it, I said, here's my idea. Let's just build 5 propellers for each submarine. I said, I'm a boat racer guy, so sometimes you want a propeller that accelerates a little faster. Sometimes we want one that just goes fast. Sometimes we want one that just is more maneuverable. You know, so we might have a different propeller for each application. I said, I got to believe you guys, you're fighting a war out there with a whole bunch of different chess pieces. And half of them you don't know where they are. Wouldn't you like to have a different pitch to throw at them?
Yeah.
And they went, absolutely. And that's what we did.
So psychological.
The end of the Cold War was about, like I say, we came up inside of 6 months, we came up with 5 times as many submarines, and the Russians didn't have any idea what they were.
Wow.
We're out. We give up.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Really cool. It's really cool.
So, well, cool. Nice talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, you as well.
Thanks for coming on, and appreciate everything you said. And yeah, we'll have you on again in a couple months or so. Maybe continue the conversations.
Okay, cool.
All right.
right.
Thanks, Dave.
Happy
Have a good
birthday
one.
again.
Happy birthday.
The most interesting man in boat racing.
For sure. Yeah.
You got to use your
We'll do an
AI
ad.
photo generator.
Yeah. Well, we got it. That'll happen.
Like I
for
said,
sure.
I am both surprised and not surprised that Dave Villwock helped us beat the Russians in the Cold War.
It's kind of crazy.
I wish I could say like I'm just blown away, but for some reason I just had a feeling.
Yeah, it's wild.
It was really cool hearing that that's where the evolution of propellers in boat racing started.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Torpedoes.
It's wild. Yeah. I mean, all that stuff, like I said, the boat, the shapes and all that, like just all comes from, it's kind of like any other sport. Like Formula One gives stuff down to the smaller classes and IndyCar and stuff like that. It's just really unique to hear how it all happened. And that's kind of what we were trying to give our fans here is just, we have all these. I feel bad for Nick. He went through and did all these stats, and I'm like, as soon as we started talking tech, throw these stats out. This is really cool. Only
we're gonna use those again on the next one.
Yeah, for sure.
We'll keep it a little more boat racing.
But yeah, I mean, only you can give that interview to TV people, and he's not going to probably open up like that to some of the tech things that we understand and can kind of go back and forth on. And that's what's cool about here on Chasin Tails is you're not going to just get that normal, like, so where'd you win? What's your favorite this? Like, we'll sprinkle it in. But that was really cool. So hopefully our fans
to his
enjoyed
points,
this one.
man. Like when you get a chance to talk to somebody like that, you gotta let them do the talking.
Yeah, exactly.
You gotta just sit back and absorb and learn.
There wasn't much choice there.
We could, we could probably have an entire weekly podcast dedicated to Dave Villwock and all the knowledge and stories and everything that guy has.
For sure, we'll get him to record a tech tip. We'll just ask a certain thing every week.
You know what I do want to do though?
When YouTube's all about long form, so it'll work.
Next time we do the hydro sim, Chasin Tails hydro sim night, we got to get him to participate. We got to put him in more.
That would be funny.
Dude, it'd be so cool. I can't wait to hear you give Scott Przybylski's. That's his biggest nightmare, man. Dave comes in and starts, oh, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, these boats don't drive nothing like they do in real life.
No offense, Scott. That's not knocking you at all.
Yeah,
You're doing a fantastic job.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah. So I think we decided we're going to take next week off. We're going to put a lot of this little clips out. We got a lot of content coming out, stuff like that. We're going to start those 5-10 minute interviews with some of our drivers, crew members, people like that, and start putting them out as well. So we're going to take a little break, but we'll be back in a couple weeks with another guest. Hope you enjoyed it. This was a fun one for us for sure. Drop in the comments if you want us to have Dave back on here in a couple months and continue this conversation because we were just starting to unlock a lot of things there. So we appreciate you watching episode 78 of Chasin Tails.
I've received like